as I emphasized, one of the characteristic elements of poverty policy in the United States is that, well, you have these broad patterns that Kevin laid out very nicely. Much of the policy making falls to the states, and Lily laid out those options. But most of the basic service delivery and the actual administration of those policies falls to local governments. And this is in part an artifact of, the very early years of poverty policy, when 19th, early 20th century, poverty was something that was, to the degree it was dealt with at all, taken care of by churches, local charitable organizations, and counties, and that sort of thing. But it's also, importantly, an artifact of that New Deal moment, when at the same moment we create a federal policy, we give it to local governments to administer, largely because of the power of Southerners in Congress at the time, who didn't want broad-based benefits delivered to the South. So our next speaker is Brian Loring, who's Executive Director of the Neighborhood Centers of Johnson County, one of the sort of principal service points for services to low-income families in this area. Brian will speak then to the sort of on-the-ground experience of these policies and these policy changes. Brian's a neighbor of mine, and I will say that he's the owner of the most pathetically friendly dog on the east side of Iowa City.
Thanks, Colin. Colin and I do exchange dog care on occasion, so anyway, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. I actually thought I would have the anonymity of a panel here. I didn't know I was going to have to get up to the podium, so I'm going to go sort of free-form here, so bear with me. But I thought one of the things I would talk about, as Kevin talked about welfare reform in the 1990s, 1996, I thought maybe I'd take a moment and put a face to that and sort of how that played out locally for us as an agency that serves low-income folks here in Iowa City. One of the things, if you look at the history of welfare, AFDC in particular, I think one of the things that you'll note is that the values, I think, that supported the original welfare as we used to know it, was that it put an emphasis and it sort of put a value on parents caring for their own children. So there was a notion that if for some circumstance beyond your control you were unable to care for your children because you've lost a job or whatever, or you were widowed, you would have some relief and support to provide that care. Welfare reform in 1996, I think, what the underpinning values of that piece of legislation and that reform really was one that was intended to get people off welfare and into work, which is okay, except one of the outcomes of that, or one of the results of that, is that we have a lot of families who needed to put children in child care. And that was a huge change in that most of those families, Lily talked about child care assistance, so most of the families that were going to be using the new welfare reform, the new assistance under welfare reform, are going to have to find work and therefore have to find child care for their children. Well, we were not in any way prepared to provide that care as a community. There was not really anything in place to provide the supports necessary for these families to go into the workforce, because primarily, number one, child care assistance, which is administered in the state by Department of Human Services, is it's a challenging program to get money out of. And so if you're a provider of child care, the last thing you want to do is work with Department of Human Services, because they don't pay any money up front. If a child's ill, they don't pay for the day the child's ill. If you go to a private center and tell the center that you'll pay them at the end of the month for your child care, they'll show you the door. So center-based care really was not an option. And those centers that did provide care for children whose parents were receiving child care assistance usually limited the number of children that they would accept. So we've now thrown out this federal legislation saying we could have easily called Get a Job, and we've put people into the workforce. And at that time, it was really kind of interesting, because in the mid-90s, the economy was roaring hot. There were jobs. So there were opportunities for people to find work, but there was not childcare. And so as an impact on our agency, we have centers located in Iowa City, one on the west side, which is, if many of you may know, the Pheasant Ridge Apartments out on the west side, off of Mormon Track, and then on the southeast side on Broadway Street we have a center. And when I started back in 1995 at the neighborhood centers, we had a child care cooperative at our Broadway center, and we had about 12 kids in that cooperative. And their parents would work some, and then in return they would be able to drop their child off and go run errands or whatever. It was pretty low key and hunky funky. It wasn't a very intense early child care program. We had after school programs, but this was for children under 5. By 1997, we were doing about 140 slots of daycare, primarily because the neighborhood demanded it, and the needs were so great that we went from 1995 doing 12 slots of cooperative daycare to about 140 slots by 1997. So it was a dramatic shift for us locally to try to meet this emerging demand for child care. One of the other problems or consequences of this system in which we distribute money for child care is that parents have to work a certain number of hours per week. And if they don't work those hours per week, they lose their child care. Well, what we saw happening was that children would be in child care for a month, 2 months, 3 weeks, whatever. They would, for some reason, their parent would lose their job, or they would get their hours cut, or whatever. Parent would lose their child care. So we would see a yo-yo effect where kids were coming in and out of program constantly. So those children were not, we have an accredited child care program. It's accredited by the National Association of the Education of Young Children. Very prestigious accreditation. Takes a lot of time and energy to put that kind of a program together. But these kids were not getting the benefit of that program because they were being pulled in and out of it. And so, previously had a system that valued parents being the child's first teacher and caring for the child in the home, to a system which valued the parent working, but didn't really have a lot in place to manage the outgrowth of that shift in policy to manage what was going to happen with those kids. And so I continue to worry about this generation of kids who are now entering school or been in school for a while, who have been a part of child care. I see a lot of kids being cared for in home settings with a relative or a neighbor, being passed around from household to household without a lot of quality in those cares, sometimes being parked in front of a television for hours while their parents at work. It's concerning, and it's clearly sort of the unintended consequence of a policy that was not motivated by protecting children, but motivated by making sure that people were working for their benefits. And not to say that working is a bad thing. I'm not trying to imply that, but I think it did have some consequences for young children. And I look at some other state initiatives that have happened in the previous decade or so. In '99 and 2000, there was the economy again was very hot, and Governor Vilsack in '99 and 2000 put together a panel, sort of a blue ribbon panel of folks to look at the future of Iowa, and looking at how many folks are we going to need in this state in order to meet the emerging demands for employees. And at that point, we didn't really foresee any kind of recession on the horizon in 1999, 1998, 99. So there was a push in the late 90s, 2000, 2001, to encourage folks to move to Iowa. And so we set up these welcome centers around the state. There was one in Muscatine, there was one in western Iowa, where we would be welcoming folks into the state. A lot of immigrants, Mexican folks from Mexico and Texas and so forth, were moving into the state to take jobs that did exist at that time, but since the economy has cooled off. And so now we're, as an agency, we're working with a lot of folks that moved to the state to take those jobs, but now find themselves without work. So that's sort of an outgrowth of some state public policy. And we're also, as Lily talked about, improving the child care assistance stuff. We're working with a lot of the children of those families who, again, are not consistently in program. And we actually, neighborhood centers actually introduced, we met with legislators last year and worked with the legislative services folks to put a bill together to allow for more categorical or presumed eligibility for child care assistance for kids who are in quality programs. So actually that bill passed the Senate last year, and we're working, has been reintroduced in the House this year by Representative Mary Masher from Iowa City, and we're hopeful to see that actually move ahead this year. Other things, and just again, didn't really come prepared, so I don't know how to sort of close this out smoothly, but I'm going to try. Looking at more local issues, if any of you are tracking kind of the redistricting issue for the city of Iowa City, anybody aware of that issue? Iowa City's in the process of redistricting, and one of the goals of that process is to lower the free and reduced lunch numbers at any given school. Seems that priority's moved down the list a little in the past week or so, but that's one of the issues that they're trying to address. And my first response to that is that the way in which resources for agencies like neighborhood centers or for school districts, the way in which those resources are put out there to serve families, they're put out there in ways that really reward concentrations of poverty. So, the school district right now has these grants for after-school programs, 21st century grants, and I worry that we won't be able to attract those grants because the eligibility requirements for application are such that you have to have a concentration of about 50% of your students in a school need to be on free or reduced lunch. So if we move that to 20%, those schools will lose out on those after-school opportunities and not be able to provide those services free of charge to the kids in those schools, which ends up costing parents money who need to put children in after-school programs and so forth and so on. So while we have this an intention of doing the right thing, which I support, the notion of reducing the concentration, I also realize as a practitioner of human services that at some point the way in which we put resources out there to folks in my business and to school districts and so forth is based upon need and a concentration of need. So I don't know. I don't really have much more. I could continue to talk, but I suppose we need to take a break and get to the panel, so I'll turn it back over to Colin.